come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. My mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening now to impose a new kind of corporate feudalism on our country, to commoditize our children, our Purple Mountain's majesty, to poison our children and our people with chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, to strip mine our assets, to hollow out the middle class, and keep us in a constant state of war.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The 1960s was a period of resistance, disruption, protests, challenges to authority, and creative attempts to build a more loving, just, and transformative world, especially among a new generation of young people who matured after the post-war world. As Bob Dylan put it, there was music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air. Many were convinced humanity desperately needed revolutionary leadership, only to find in America there was a national stalemate, its goals and vision ambiguous, its democratic system apathetic and manipulated rather than of, by, and for the people. They were guided by the sense that theirs may be the last generation in the experiment with living. The decade began with the brief 1,000 days of John F. Kennedy's presidency, a Camelot moment of youthful passion, hopeful expectations, and idealism that came to a crushing halt by his assassination on November 22nd, 1963. It was a watershed moment for the country and for JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, whose grief and despair expressed the feelings of many in the country. 1968 represented the tumultuous high watermark of the movement, the counterculture, the civil rights and anti-war movements, the women's movement, and others that evolved and tried to radically transform America and the world. But we saw the assassinations of Martin Luther King on April 4th and Robert Kennedy on June 5th, barely 2 months apart. They had come to represent America's best hopes and visions for racial peace, nonviolent change, and a transformative world. Robert Kennedy was the one white politician who understood the movement best. He came to relate profoundly to the suffering and needs of people of all backgrounds, but especially to those of the poor and disenfranchised. They felt and came to know that his concern was genuine and real, and he returned his caring and love with their own to him. He wasn't just an ordinary politician. In his remarkable 1968 insurgent presidential campaign, he had widespread support among working class whites, in Black and Indigenous communities, poorer and low-income people, among Hispanics, and of course, the young. On June 5th, he won the California primary and had the momentum to win the nomination. That evening, he was shot. The next day, the hated, inane Vietnam War continued, and the election of right-wing Nixon administration was ushered in, along with harsher, crueler times filled with paranoia, fear, increased polarization, mass incarceration, and bogus racialized wars on crime and drugs. Heart and minds became hardened and even more cynical and despairing. We are really excited and thrilled, blessed to have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Radical Imagination today. He's a Democratic candidate for president in 2024. For your information, he can be reached at kennedy24.com. He also can be seen on RFK Jr. podcasts at all podcast outlets. And his insurgent campaign is already showing remarkably. His strength at the polls have him at 20% of the vote after declaring his candidacy only 2 months ago. Bobby is a highly respected environmental law specialist, a strong advocate for environmental justice, a politician and writer who is the son of U.S. Attorney General and New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy and nephew of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Through litigation, lobbying, and public campaigns and activism, he's advocated for the protection of waterways, indigenous rights, and renewable energy. Bobby has been in the forefront in making the Hudson River and Long Island Sound dramatically safer and environmentally cleaner. He's the author of the acclaimed The Real Antonio Fauci and A Letter to Liberals. The 60s were then, this is now. History doesn't repeat itself, but there are parallels. It would be hard to dispute that the same issues and struggles continue to fester in greater complexity and destructiveness today. They demand change and even greater urgency than was the case over 6 decades ago. America is still looking in these hyper-polarized times for a common sense candidate and a president who can heal and bring us together with love, vision, compassion, and justice. So welcome, Bobby, to the Radical Imagination. Thank you so very, very much for being here. I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you, follows from the opening, is how can you bring this? How can you bring this country more together? We're so polarized. Is there a possibility of consensus? Is there possibly a return to some sort of civility, discussion of the facts, and so on? So, if you'd like to expand on that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, Jim, I think that the country is ready to come together, and that the path to doing that is by being truthful with people. One of the things that's tearing our country apart, one of the primary factors, is the growing deception by government and all the other institutions that are supposed to provide us information and stability. Our government is dysfunctional and dishonest. And people know that they're being lied to. They were lied to. They're being lied to now about the Ukraine war. They were lied to about COVID. They were lied to about the war in Iraq, and about many, many other issues. And it's like when you have a dysfunctional parents in a very, very large family, and they're lying to the children, the entire family becomes dysfunctional and starts battling each other and becomes polarized. My father was living in a similar time, although this is, I would say, even more amplified. But he ran during a time of great division in our country over civil rights, over the Vietnam War. There was really two visions, then as now, two visions of America. And he was able to unite these disparate groups in a populist movement and his strategy was simply to tell the truth to people. And, when my father made his decision to run, he had almost no chance of winning, and he didn't believe that he could win. He ran. It was a moral choice for him because he pictured that if he was sitting on the sidelines and watching Johnson run against Nixon and McCarthy, who he did not like or trust, who he believed was in the tank with the big bankers and the insurance industry, that if people asked him if he supported McCarthy, he could not honestly say that he did, and he couldn't support Johnson. And if he sat on the sidelines, he would kind of be forced to make a choice, and he didn't want to do that, so he ran himself, and that kind of the hopelessness of his prospects liberated him to be incredibly honest with people. And so when medical school students at the University of Indiana asked him how he was going to pay for his health care, who was going to pay for his national health care program, he told them, "You are." And they booed him originally, but they gave him a standing ovation at the end of his speech. When he went to Creighton University and many, many others, Creighton was a Catholic university in Indiana or in Nebraska, and the students there asked him whether he would preserve the draft deferments, which was a critical issue for students, as you probably remember at that time. We had the largest college population in history because you could get a deferment from the Vietnam War if you could show that you were in college. And many of the students at that time were absolutely in college because they wanted to avoid the war. They wanted the deferment. And my father, McCarthy, was going to preserve the deferments. My father said he wouldn't. And he was booed. And then he asked them, he said, 25% of the paratroopers in Vietnam are Black. They've been drafted. And he said, you go to a Catholic university. Is that consistent with your Catholic values, that people who are wealthy enough to go to college and privileged enough to go to college can avoid risking their lives for our country, and that we're sending instead Black kids to fight our country's wars? And in the end, they gave him a standing ovation when he went to Watts, which was then burning and lawless. He talked about law and order. And when he went to the University of Alabama, which he and his brother had forcibly integrated in Tuscaloosa 5 years earlier by federalizing the National Guard, he talked about civil rights, and they gave him a standing ovation. And the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in our country, South Dakota, and the most urban state, California, and he had succeeded in uniting the country in so many ways. And I've often talked about the last train ride with him. Take his body from Penn Station in New York down to Union Station in Washington. That ride took 7.5 hours. It should have taken 2.5. It took 7.5 because there were 2 million people on that train tracks. And they were the cross section of America. They were Blacks and whites. All of the platforms were in urban areas like Newark and Trenton and Wilmington and Baltimore, were crowded with thousands and thousands of Black men and women and children singing the battle hymn of the Republic as we crawled through those stations with the windows of the trains open, and the landscapes on outside of the cities were crowded with white men and women and people of every color, Boy Scouts saluting, Little Leaguers saluting, military people, hippies, rabbis, priests, nuns, etc. And 4 years later, I was looking at demographic data in Boston when I was going to college and studying American history and populism, the history of populism in our country. And I saw that the vast majority of those people, those white people who had crowded that track after his death and who had supported him strongly in the primary, voted 4 years later not for George McGovern, but instead for who was aligned with my father in every issue. Did I say George McGovern earlier? If I did, I meant Gene McCarthy, who ran in '68 against my father. But George McGovern ran in '72. And the people who followed my father, the white people who followed my father, did not vote for him largely in '72. Instead, they voted for George Wallace, who was antithetical to everything my father stood for. Who was a racist, an avowed segregationist. And it occurred to me then, and has struck me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. and that the easiest thing for a political leader to do is to appeal to our anger and our greed and our fear and our misogyny and racism and bigotry and xenophobia, and that it's much more difficult to do what my father was trying to do, which is to get people to transcend their narrow self-interest and their greed and fear, and see themselves as part of a community, and take risks and make sacrifices for that community, and feel that they're part of some great adventure. The American experiment with self-governance, and that was supposed to make us an exemplary nation, an example to the template for the rest of the world. And my father was able to do that. And, I remember him saying that, in South America, where they had these big disparities in wealth between rich and poor, and U.S. policy was to support the oligarchs, which were anti-communist naturally, and the military juntas who we were, fortifying with weapons and U.S. aid. And my father said, if we keep doing that, there's going to be a revolution, and America ought to be on the side of the poor. And he said, if we keep our policies, that the revolution is going to be owned by the communists, and they're going to take over the way they've taken over Cuba, and we have to befriend the poor. And that's why he and his brother started the Alliance for Progress. They started USAID, which, at that time those were about aiding the poor and building middle classes in that country that could create support stable democracies. And I think what he said about Latin America at that time is true for America today, where people are living in similar kinds of poverty. And you have a middle class that feels desperate and forgotten, and that there is a revolution coming in our country, and that it either can be owned by Donald Trump, who has kind of what I would say kind of a darker vision for America, or it can be mobilized to support the highest ideals of this country, which is what I will try to do during my campaign. And I'm going to do that by telling the truth to people, no matter how costly or unpleasant the truth is, and also by treating people with respect, by listening to them and making them understood they're being listened to, and by, and just through civility, but by saying what I mean without saying it mean. And I think that's a lesson we all have to learn. And I think, we can bring our country back together.
See here, it's the first time we've met, but as you're talking, I am taken back to that time when I was a student as well, and I was a supporter of your father, and just an enormous breath of fresh air and intelligence and passion and so on. And I hear that in your voice as well. Now, saying all of that, you are running as a Democrat. What are your hopes for the Democratic Party? What is your goals in the sense of direction you would like to see it take? And along with that, you've mentioned a number of times issues of poverty. And what has been your connection, if any, with Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign? As you know, your father and Martin Luther King were eulogized so much during the 60s. And Barber has tried to take up the mantle, in a sense, for the Poor People's Campaign. And I was wondering what you feel about his ideas of a fusion politics, which I think your father had, and you seem to be also saying you want to have. Because I think that's really how it's going to happen. If you're going to win, it's going to have to be an insurgent campaign where you bring the if you will, the old movement back together again. And Barber is, in a sense, trying to do that. I wonder what you think of his work, his ideas of fusion politics, and the spiritual progressivism that he seems to enunciate as he does so well. The language of, in a sense, politicians are puny, as he puts it. There are, tell the truth, stand in the breach, etc. So, have you been in touch with Reverend Barbara?
Well, to answer your question about the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
I want to bring the Democratic Party back to its traditional ideals, the ideals that it represented during the time that my uncle and my father were leading the party. That means, a party that is skeptical toward the military-industrial complex, that is resistant to this addiction to forever wars, that is skeptical also of this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that now has turned the regulatory agencies of our government into predatory organisms against the American people, that are no longer doing public health and environmental protection as much as they are trying to advance the mercantile interests of the industries that they're supposed to be regulating, and that in fact have captured them. The use of fear as a governing tool should be rejected by the Democratic Party, as it was by Franklin Roosevelt when he said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because he recognized that fear was the most potent instrument for totalitarian control. I don't think the neocons, or these very bellicose group, that got us into the Iraq War, that tricked America and lied America into the Iraq War, which cost us $8 trillion.
Yeah.
That they should be permanently banished from American foreign policy leadership. And instead, we thought they were pariahs and that they were in exile forever.
After Vietnam, right?
Well, no, after Iraq.
I understand that the same mentality was operating with the Vietnam War too, right?
Yeah, it was the same. I mean, it was the lesson we were supposed to have learned in Vietnam.
Right. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Did I interrupt you?
No. I'm agreeing with you that this goes way back. And how do we root this out? This mentality, and the Democrats, the neocons, and neoliberals, for that matter, don't seem to have the backbone, the courage to stand up. They become evasive. They become ambiguous. You can see this happening all over the place. I mean, even in New York City here, our mayor is having, after 18 months, the police chief has resigned. He's got other, people are resigned. They for a variety of reasons, but again, people see the the establishment Democratic Party as not having the vision, the integrity, the truth that you're searching for. Not that you have all that truth, everything. You're not saying you're an absolute. You're not saying that you have all the answers, but you are saying, let's talk about this. Let's have that honest discussion, which I agree with you. We're not having it in the corporate media. We don't have it in government, and less and less so, of course, even in the universities and so on. So how do you begin to change this around? Let me also just mention one thing here. I want to get into the area of public safety and public health. I want to understand how we can talk about getting away from a fear-driven, punitive mindset and political orientation into one that is more healing, that economically is more moderate and more giving and more compassionate and so on. You called yourself a free marketeer or an absolute capitalist or capitalist absolutist. What does that mean, and what would that mean in terms of your economic policy?
Well, I believe free markets. Particularly, I've been a champion for market in the environmental sector for 40 years. I came out, up through the environmental movement, working for commercial fishermen on the Hudson River, and they had a very well managed fishery for 350 years that was sustainable. They saw that it was the polluters who were stealing their fishery. It wasn't any kind of failure of their business model.
Okay.
business model worked. And it was, it was a regulated fishery that was self-regulated by the commercial fishermen. That, on the Hudson, the way they would do it is they count the fish, the recruiters, what they call the recruitment fish, the fish that are breeders, how many are coming back into the river every year, and then they would lift their nets 1 day or 2 days or 3 days a week so that you can have enough recruiters in the river for the next year's stock.
Right.
And they did this, and it was scientifically done for centuries. And they kept this fishery for sturgeon, for herring, for shad, for alewives, for blue crab, and it was a booming business. There were thousands during the Great Depression. There were 10,000 men went down to the Hudson and found sustenance and jobs. And then the General Electric Company came in and stole that all away from them by putting pollution in the river in order to take a shortcut, because it didn't want to pay the full price to bring its product to market. And that's what I mean by free market capitalism.
I understand.
In a true free market will promote efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich, without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else and escaping the discipline of the free market. In a true free market, would force us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. And polluters get away with this by externalizing their costs and by forcing somebody else to pay the cost of bringing their product to market. Includes the cost of cleaning up after themselves, which is a lesson we were all supposed to learn in kindergarten.
Right.
They, dump their pollution on the rest of us, and then we pay the cost. And and that is not free market capitalism. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. And what I did for 40 years as an environmental attorney for fishermen and surfers and others, I acted the part of a free marketeer. I went out into the marketplace, found the cheaters, found people who were cheating by privatizing the commons, by polluting our waterways rather than properly disposing of their waste. And I would bring them to court and say to them, I'm going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. And what we have to understand is that there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a society more democratic, more efficient, more prosperous, and corporate crony capitalism, which is what we have in this country today, which is as antithetical to democracy, efficiency, and prosperity in America as it is in Nigeria.
Got it.
And that's what I mean by real markets. I'm very, very suspicious of top-down controls because I believe those also, that there are. Naomi Klein wrote this wonderful book, The Shock Doctrine, in which she shows that anytime there's a crisis, you're going to get these, big corporate behemoths to come in and use that crisis to privatize the commons and to steal our constitutional rights, to enlarge their powers and enlarge their wealth. And the environmental crisis is not immune from that, nor was COVID. We saw that in COVID. We saw how corporations took advantage of a global crisis to enlarge their wealth, corporations and their government allies, and to clamp down totalitarian control, to abridge our rights. And the same thing is of course, the climate crisis is susceptible to the same sorts of manipulation. And so that's why I'm much more comfortable with free market.
Minister, is that same model, could that be applied to the criminal justice system as well, the prison industrial complex, do you think? and budgets in the police departments?
Well, I think some functions are the province of governments rather than should not be subject to market manipulations and market competition. For example, sewage treatment plant. You can't leave sewage plants because you're dealing with a commonly owned property, which is the waterway, which nobody owns. And nobody is going to build, nobody has voluntarily ever built a sewage treatment plant. Some functions must remain the functions of government. And I would say that prisons and public utilities are among those, that those are government functions by their nature. They're supposed to preserve and serve the commons rather than serving private mercantile interests of private profit-making investors.
So you would be against the privatization of prisons?
Yeah, I'm against the privatization of prison. I think you start commoditizing,
right?
Human beings, and particularly people who have no rights. There's too much temptation to abuse that kind of power, and I do not think that should be left in private hands. I think prisons are a public function by their nature, as are highways.
Okay.
As are the protection of the waterways, the shorelines, the oceans. These are part of the commons, and they should not be reduced to private property ownership and profit incentives. It's a recipe for destruction.
And again, this model could be applied to reduce the enormous inequalities of wealth that we're experiencing as well, correct?
Well, it's not, the big disparities in wealth is not sustainable in a democracy. It's a configuration. If you have, these huge aggregations of wealth above and just widespread poverty below, those disparities are a configuration that any political scientist will tell you is too unstable to sustain democracy. And so I think, it's important, and you look at measures of happiness in nations that, that have these big disparities of wealth. And there's very little happiness either among the very rich or among the very poor. The happiest countries are the countries that have found ways to reduce those disparities. And I think we need to keep looking at those ways to reduce the big disparities in wealth.
Let's radically imagine that you are in a national debate, which you should be, with the other candidates. Cornel West is there, Marianne Williamson, Joe Biden, so Democratic candidate. What would you say directly? I'm Anderson Cooper, imagine. It's really radically imagining. But you've given the question directly to speak to the American people directly about some of the criticisms that have been foisted your way concerning the virus and how America has been manipulated by those in power by it, by the big drug companies and so on. What would you say to them, very concretely, very practically, you and the American people, face to face?
What I always say is, show me where I got it wrong. That's what I'd say to Anderson Cooper. Show me one fact that I got wrong.
Okay. And your advice?
Then I would ask Anderson Cooper,
sure,
whether the fact that his show accepts the majority of its money from Pfizer,
right?
Did that have any impact, or does he think that the optics of that are troubling at all for Americans who are trying to trust the media and who became distrustful of the media during its coverage of COVID? It was a coverage that was relentlessly dishonest
and ambiguous and back and forth. So the American people never got a clear picture of what to do. So at this point, what would you tell them to do?
To do
Should
what?
they be?
To do about what?
Well, we supposedly, should we prepare for the next pandemic? And
I would say we should stop making bioweapons.
Okay.
And we should resurrect the bioweapons treaty so that this does not happen again.
Okay. All right. Are you planning on entering any primaries?
I'm entering all the primaries.
Great. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you so much. I know you've got to run. It's been a pleasure. I hope we can do this again. There's many, many more questions, but I appreciate very much meeting you, and thank you again very, very much. Good luck your campaign. Again, for our audience information, wanting more information, please go to kennedy24.com. You've got the RFK Jr. podcast, and I've listened to the recent ones you've had with Mike Taibbi, and last night was Taibbi was on the podcast a couple of days ago, but the wonderful interview you had with Glenn Greenwald. So I commend you very much, and thank you so much for bringing the level of discourse up to a much higher level and this is what we really need to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Okay, all the best. Take care. All the best.
Thank you.
And thank you so very, very much
Thank
for
you.
listening to us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Bredos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
So tell us, why did you decide to run for president?
I felt like my country was being taken away from me. I felt like I wanted my children to grow up with the same pride in our country and the same love for our country, and that we had, communities that were filled with dignity and enrichment, and that we were an exemplary nation, and that those things are being lost.
You've never held a political position before. Obviously, you've been in environmental law for more than 3 decades. But what do you feel qualifies you for the highest position in the land?
I think I know more about how to fix regulatory agencies than any other politician in this country, because I've spent 40 years suing them. And when you sue a regulator, you get kind of a PhD in how they work and how to unravel this kind of culture of corporate capture and corruption. And there are ways we can fix these agencies, and we can do it very quickly.
Well, how would you do that? I want to just, because you've been very critical on multiple government agencies, from the CIA, the EPA, the DOT, the CDC, the FDA. If you were to become president, you would effectively be the boss of all of these agencies that you've cast so many aspersions on, and said publicly that there's so much distrust there.
I think most of the people, 90% of the people in those agencies, are good Americans. They're good public servants. They're patriots. They are idealistic, and they want to do their jobs. The problem is, the people who rise to power in those agencies usually are the people who are in the tank with industry, who are willing to carry water for the industry, and they're the ones that last for 50 years. They rise because they're willing to do favors for industry and take directions from industry.
Why do you feel that you should challenge Joe Biden?
He's friends with my family. I've considered him a friend. I don't believe that we should be the party of war. I don't believe that we should be the party of Wall Street. I don't believe that we should let neocons dictate our foreign policy. And I don't believe in censorship, for starters. And those are all values that are traditional Democratic Party values that this White House has departed from.
The other day, when you made your announcement that you were going to run for president, you invoked your dad when he was running for president back in 1968. I'd like to take a listen.
He was running against a president of his own party. My father, when he declared, had not a single molecule in him that he believed that he could win the Democratic nomination.
Do you have a single molecule that you believe that you can win?
I actually think I can win. But, I'm not a soothsayer. I'm going to try. I'm going to wake up every day, and I'm going to campaign. I'm going to talk to Americans. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. And then, well, it's in God's hands whether I win or not.
What do you think is the fairest criticism?
Of me?
Yeah.
I've got as many defects as I do have assets. I told my wife I have more skeletons in my closet. I have so many that if they could vote, I could, win president of the world by a landslide. So I'm not a guy who, who's coming to you and saying I'm a perfect human being. I'm not. I'm coming here because I believe in something, and I think people know that if I believe in something, that number one, you can change my mind if you confront me with facts. Number two, if you don't change my mind with facts, I'm going to stick to my guns, and nobody can move me.
You've said in the past that there is a correlation between vaccines leading to autism. That's totally been debunked.
Wait a minute, who debunked it?
The CDC, the World Health Organization, the National Academy of Sciences.
Those organizations are captive agencies, Lindsay.
And so you think they're all in cahoots?
Yeah, they're all captive.
Several of your relatives have not just said that they disagree with you, but they've called you dangerous. And as you're probably well aware, there were two of your siblings and a niece who wrote in a Politico article back in 2019, he's helped to spread dangerous misinformation over social media and is complicit in sowing distrust of science behind vaccines. We stand behind him in his ongoing fight to protect our environment. However, on vaccines, he's wrong. Your sister Rory has said, I admire his past work as an environmentalist. Because of him, we can swim in the Hudson. But due to a wide range of Bobby's positions, I'm supporting President Biden. And I'm just curious, if you are not able to get your own sisters to vote for you for president, how would you make that appeal to American voters?
What is your family like? Do they agree with everything that you say and do?
They'd probably vote for me if I ran for president.
Yeah, well, I have siblings who will vote for me as well, but I have a big family, and many of them will not. I have two siblings who came to my announcement and a lot of other relatives as well. I love my family. We grew up arguing with each other, and we are very, very, I think, comfortable disagreeing with each other, both publicly and privately on issues, and at the same time loving each other. And that's something that I think is a lesson that we ought to learn for this country.
Your final pitch to voters.
We need to look at what's happened to our country. We need to try to arrest this emergence of corporatism, of the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that's undermining our values, that's strip mining our landscapes, that is stealing the assets of the middle class of this country. Let's try to take a new path that will allow us to give our children a country that is, once again, a moral authority around the globe, an exemplary nation, and that has a booming middle class in this country that can sustain democracy.
Our thanks to Lindsay. We should note that during that conversation, Kennedy made false claims about the relationship between vaccination and autism. We've used our editorial judgment in not including extended portions of those exchanges in this interview. Research shows vaccines do not cause autism, including studies by medical associations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and others. Now, one-on-one with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the controversial activist now challenging President Biden. And his candidacy may not be such a long shot. A new Fox News poll showing 19% of likely Democratic voters say they'd like to see RFK Jr. win the nomination. Here's ABC's Lindsay Davis.
So tell us, why did you decide to run for president?
I felt like my country was being taken away from me. I felt like I wanted my children to grow up with the same pride in our country and the same love for our country, and that we had, communities that were filled with dignity and enrichment, and that we were an exemplary nation. And that